In the far reaches of the galaxy, a great alien empire had ruled for centuries, and its power was feared by many. But everything changed when the leader of that empire fell in a brutal war against the united human fleets, and the galaxy trembled with the shock of his defeat, because no one had believed that fragile humans could bring down a ruler who commanded worlds. Yet the impossible had happened, and from that moment, history began to move in a strange new direction. The story begins with David, a human soldier who had not expected to survive the last battle, because the alien armies were mighty and their machines of war filled the skies with fire. But David held his ground among thousands of others, and when the alien leader finally fell, the alien fleets scattered, and their armies surrendered in shame and fear. David was only one soldier among many, yet fate had chosen him for something far beyond his understanding, and soon he would discover that victory came with a price he never asked for. When the fighting ended, David walked among the ruins of a fallen city that had once been the heart of alien power. The building still burned, and the cries of the wounded echoed through the broken streets, and as he searched for survivors, he was taken by alien guards who did not harm him, but brought him before a council of elders who now claimed to speak for the fallen empire. David stood confused and wary, because he had expected chains or execution, yet instead the elders bowed with strange respect and told him that by the ancient laws of their people, the man who defeated the leader, or who stood in his place, must take responsibility for the household of the fallen ruler. David did not understand their words at first, but then they explained that the ruler had left behind 3 wives, and by law, they could not be left alone, for to leave them alone would dishonor the memory of the leader and would bring chaos to the clans. And so they said that David the human must marry them at once, because he stood as a conqueror, and it was the way of their people, and if he refused, then war would begin again, and blood would once more fill the stars. David felt his breath grow heavy, because he had come to fight, not to wed, and never had he dreamed of marrying even one alien woman, let alone 3. But the council was firm, and their voices rang with iron and sorrow as they reminded him that the eyes of the empire watched, and if he rejected their law, the rebellion would rise again. David looked into their faces, and he saw not cruelty, but desperation, because they feared what would come if the law was broken. The chamber fell silent as the 3 wives of the fallen leader entered, and David felt the weight of destiny settle upon him, because these women were not like humans, and yet in their eyes he saw emotions that he could understand: grief, anger, pride, and something hidden that he could not name. The first wife was named Lyra, and she carried herself with grace, though her eyes were filled with tears, and she bowed her head as if her soul had been broken by the death of her husband. The second wife was named Mira, and her gaze was sharp and fierce, and she looked upon David with hatred, as if he were nothing more than the murderer of the one she had loved. And the third was named Tara, and she stood quietly with a mask of calm upon her face, but her eyes carried secrets that pierced through David like cold fire. David felt his heart tremble as the council declared the law once more, and the wives stood before him, each with their own burden of pain and pride, and he thought of his home on earth, and the life he had lost when war pulled him into the stars. He thought of his friends who had died, and of the peace he had fought to win, and now he was told that peace demanded he marry the wives of his enemy and bind himself to them in the eyes of their people. David wished to shout in protest, but he saw that any word against the law would undo the fragile peace, and the galaxy would fall back into war. The hall grew heavy with silence, and every alien present stared at David, waiting for his answer. He felt the weight of thousands pressing upon his shoulders, and he knew that this was not only about himself, but about the fate of 2 civilizations. He looked again at the 3 women: Lyra, who seemed gentle and broken, Mira, who burned with rage, and Tara, who stood unreadable, and he realized that they too were prisoners of this law, just as he was, and none of them had asked for this union, yet none of them could escape it. David finally spoke in a voice that shook with both fear and strength. He said that he did not understand their customs, and he did not know their ways, but he would not bring war again, and if peace demanded this sacrifice, then he would accept, though his heart was uncertain. The council nodded with solemn approval, and the law was sealed in that moment. The fate of David and the 3 alien wives was bound together forever. As the wives were led away, the council told David that the empire would now look to him for guidance, because he was not only their husband by law, but also a symbol of power to their clans. David felt the ground shake beneath him, not from war, but from the weight of destiny, and he wondered if peace could truly be born from such a union, or if it was only the beginning of a darker path he could not yet see. That night David was taken to a chamber within the ruined palace, and he sat in silence staring at the alien stars. Through shattered glass he thought of the 3 wives and the way their eyes had spoken to him. Without words he thought of the council and the heavy law that had been placed upon his shoulders, and he felt the cold grip of fear and the fire of duty burn inside him, and he realized that his life as a soldier had ended, but his life as something else had just begun, and the galaxy would soon learn what it meant when a human was forced by alien law to marry 3 wives of a fallen leader. The morning after the law was declared, David was summoned to stand once more before the alien council, and when the great doors opened, he found the 3 wives waiting for him, their faces unreadable yet filled with emotions that twisted his heart. The air was heavy, and all eyes turned to him, because this was no longer about war, but about unity and survival, and the weight of it pressed upon him like iron chains. The first to step forward was Lyra, her soft steps echoing in the chamber, her hands folded before her, as if she carried an invisible burden. She looked at David with eyes that still held the shadow of grief, yet within that sorrow there was a strange gentleness. As though she did not wish for more fighting, she bowed her head in silence, and though David did not know her language well, he understood her pain. He felt a pull in his heart because she seemed to want peace even in the ruins of her world. The second wife, Mira, did not bow nor soften her gaze. She stepped forward with her chin high and her eyes blazing with fire. She looked at David as though he were an intruder in her home, as though he were the one who had torn her life apart, and in a way, he had, for he stood as the symbol of her husband's defeat. Her voice was sharp as she spoke in her own tongue, and though David could not grasp every word, he felt the anger in her tone. She did not want this union. She did not want him. She wanted her world back, and David knew she would not accept him easily, if ever at all. The third wife, Tara, remained still for a long time, her face calm, and her body still as stone, yet her eyes never left David. She had not wept, she had not raged, she only watched, and when she finally moved, it was with a grace that carried secrets within it. She said little, but when she did, her words were quiet and heavy, like shadows in the night. David felt a strange unease around her, because he sensed that she knew more than she revealed, and perhaps she even knew truths about the fall of the leader that no one else would dare to speak. The council declared that the union would be sealed soon, yet before that David must learn to live among the wives and understand their ways, and they must learn his, because only then could peace be real. The words filled David with dread, for he had never thought of himself as a husband, and now he was bound to 3 women of another world, each with her own heart, her own sorrow, and her own hidden strength. The days that followed were heavy with silence and watchful eyes. David was given quarters in the ruined palace, and the 3 wives were placed near him. Though each lived in her own chamber, the nights were long and filled with questions that haunted his mind. He wondered how he could keep peace between them when they themselves did not trust him, nor one another. Lyra came to him first. She brought food prepared in the way of her people, and though it was strange to him, she tried to explain each piece with soft gestures. Her eyes watched him with care, as though she wanted to see if he would reject her offering. David took the food, and though the taste was bitter to him, he ate in silence and cooked the food, and though the taste was bitter to him, nodded his thanks. Lyra's lips trembled into the faintest smile, and he knew then that she wished for harmony, even if she was still bound by grief. Mayra kept her distance. She walked the halls like a warrior whose sword had been taken from her butt, whose fire had not gone out when David passed by her chamber. She would turn away, yet he could feel her eyes burning into his back. Her anger was alive and sharp, and he feared that one day it would strike him like a blade. Yet in her anger he also saw strength, and he wondered if that strength might one day save him instead of destroy him. Tara remained the most mysterious. She spoke little, yet whenever David was alone, he would sense her presence near, like a shadow that lingered in silence. Once at night he awoke to find her standing by the shattered window, staring at the stars. She did not speak. She only turned her gaze to him, and in her eyes was something he could not name. Perhaps sorrow, perhaps warning, perhaps secrets buried deeper than the ruins around them. As the days passed, David felt the tension grow. The aliens outside the palace watched and whispered, because this marriage was not only a bond, but a symbol, and if it failed, then the law would be broken and the empire might rise again in rebellion. David carried the weight of this knowledge, and each step he took was filled with fear, for he was not only trying to live with 3 wives of another kind, he was also holding the fragile peace of 2 civilizations upon his shoulders. One night the Yezo council gathered once more and told David that whispers had spread of rebels forming in the outer cities, men and women who claimed that the human conqueror had no right to the throne of their fallen leader, and that the wives should be taken from him. David's heart grew heavy with dread, for he knew that the union was not only about love or duty, it was about survival, and if he lost them, the galaxy might burn again. As he walked back to his chamber, he thought of Lyra's gentle care, Myra's fiery anger, and Tara's cold mystery, and he realized that each of them was more than a wife, more than a symbol. They were keys to the fragile future of 2 worlds, and perhaps to his own fate as well. He felt torn between fear and resolve, because he knew the days ahead would not be calm, and in his heart he wondered if these 3 women would become his allies, his enemies, or something more. That night, as he closed his eyes, he heard the distant cries of the alien city, mourning the past and fearing the future, and he felt a storm gathering beyond the palace walls, a storm that would test him and the wives and the bond that had been forced upon them. And though he could not see what lay ahead, he felt in his bones that the true trial had only just begun. The days turned into weeks, and the palace that once belonged to the alien leader now stood as a place of silence and uneasy peace. And David lived within its walls with the 3 wives who each carried their grief and their anger in different ways. Yet, even as he tried to find balance, he began to feel that something deeper was moving in the shadows, something that could not be seen but could be felt. Like a whisper carried by the wind, Lyra continued to show kindness. In small ways she brought him meals and tried to teach him the words of her people, her voice soft and patient, and though her heart still mourned, she seemed to believe that peace could grow if trust was given. David felt comfort in her presence, because she did not treat him as a stranger, but as someone who might one day be accepted. Mira, however, remained cold. She spoke to him rarely, and when she did, her words were sharp, her eyes always filled with fire. She did not want him there. She did not want this union, and yet even in her anger, she never left his side. She was bound by law, but she was also bound by something else, a loyalty to her people that ran deeper than any law or bond. Tara was the one who troubled him most, for she stayed silent most of the time, but her eyes spoke louder than any words. She watched him closely, and sometimes, when no one else was near, she would whisper questions about his people, about Earth, about why humans had fought so fiercely against her leader. Her voice carried no hate, only curiosity, yet behind her calm tone, David felt that she knew more than she let show. It was as if she was testing him, searching for something within him that he did not yet understand. One night, as the palace slept, David woke to the sound of quiet steps in the hall. He rose and followed the sound through the broken corridors where Firelight flickered against the ruined stone, and there in the shadows he found Tara waiting, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. She told him in a low voice that the fall of the leader was not only because of human strength, but also because of betrayal from within the Empire. David froze as her words sank into him, for she spoke of whispers that the leader had been weakened long before the final battle, and that factions within his own people had wished for his fall. Tara said that if he wanted to survive, he must understand the truth of the Empire, for not all would accept him as their new symbol. Some still dreamed of restoring the old ways, and they would use any weapon, even the 3 wives, to break him. David listened, his heart pounding, because he realized now that the law that bound him to the wives was not only a tradition, it was also a chain that rebels could use to strike at him. He asked Tara why she was telling him this, and she only looked at him with those unreadable eyes and said that peace was fragile, and only those who knew the truth could hope to keep it. The next day, David tried to act as if nothing had changed, but inside his mind turned with fear and questions. He looked at Mira and wondered if her fire hid secrets, if perhaps she too was tied to these factions. Lyra seemed too gentle, too sorrowful to play such games, yet even she could not be free from the weight of her people, and David realized that any of them could be both ally and danger. Tension grew within the palace. The guards outside grew restless, and rumors spread of rebels rising in distant cities. Some said they gathered weapons, others said they whispered that the human had no right to the throne of their leader. David felt the danger closing in on all sides, and he wondered if even within the walls of the palace he was truly safe. One evening, as the stars burned cold above the ruins, David walked through the great hall where banners of the fallen empire still hung, torn and broken. Mira confronted him, her eyes blazing. She demanded to know if he believed he could ever be one of them, if he thought he could ever truly rule her people. She told him that many hated him, that many would kill him if given the chance, and her voice shook with anger. But beneath that anger, David heard something else, pain and fear of what the future would bring. David looked at her and spoke with the only truth he had, that he did not want to rule. He did not want power. He only wanted peace, so that no more lives would be lost. Mira stared at him for a long moment, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, and then without another word, she turned and left, her anger burning like fire in the night. David stood in the silence of the hall, and he wondered if she was his enemy, or if deep within her heart she too wished for peace. Tara's warning lingered in his thoughts, and he began to see the world around him with new eyes. He noticed the glances of the guards, the whispers in the halls, the way the council spoke in hushed tones when they thought he could not hear, and he knew that something was being hidden from him, something that could break everything if it came to light. Then one night the palace shook with distant thunder, not of storms but of weapons, and a messenger arrived, pale with fear, to tell the council that rebels had attacked a nearby outpost. David listened as the council argued. Some demanded harsher control, some whispered of breaking the law and taking the wives from him to restore their own order. David felt his blood grow cold, for he knew then that the law which had trapped him was also the shield that kept him alive, and if it was broken, he would have no place among them. As he walked back through the dark corridors, he thought of Lyra's soft hope, Myra's burning rage, and Tara's quiet secrets, and he realized that the bond between them would decide not only his fate, but the fate of peace itself. The law had forced them together, but only trust could keep them alive, and trust was something none of them yet had to give. That night, as he lay awake, David felt the weight of eyes upon him, not from one wife, but from all 3, each watching in her own way, each carrying her own truth, and he knew that the hidden truths of the Empire would soon come crashing into the open, and when they did, his life and their lives would never be the same again. The palace grew colder with each passing day, and the tension inside its walls grew heavy like a storm that refused to break. David could feel the eyes of the guards on him whenever he moved through the halls. He could feel the whispers of the council that spread like smoke in the corners of the great chamber, and he could feel The silence of the three wives who seemed bound to him, yet also drifting away as if each carried a secret that could tear everything apart. Lyra tried to hold the fragile bond together. She came to David each morning and spoke to him softly, teaching him words of her people and listening. When he told her stories of Earth, she would smile sometimes. Though her eyes always shone with sorrow, she wanted peace so badly that David could see it in the way she touched the broken stones of the palace, as if wishing to mend not only the walls, but also the hearts. Within them Mira remained fire. She challenged him whenever she could, her voice rising with anger as she accused him of destroying her world. She said that his people had taken everything and left her with nothing. She said that his presence was an insult to the memory of the leader she once followed and loved. Yet beneath her rage, David could sometimes hear the quiver of doubt, as if she was not only angry at him, but also at herself for being forced into this bond she could not escape. Tara continued to haunt him with her silence. She would appear when least expected, her eyes calm, but filled with shadows. She asked questions that pierced through him, questions about war and truth and loyalty, and she never gave answers of her own. It was as if she was guiding him toward a truth she already knew but would not reveal, and David began to fear that when the truth came, it would change everything forever. One night, as David sat alone in the great hall, Mira came to him, her face pale with a fear he had never seen in her before. She told him that she had been forced to spy for a rebel faction when the leader still lived. She said that they had promised her safety if she gave them secrets of the palace, and she confessed that some of what she told them had helped weaken the leader before the final battle. Her voice shook as she admitted this, and her eyes filled with tears of rage, not at him, but at herself for being trapped by fear and used like a weapon against her own people. Felt the ground fall away beneath him, for Tara had warned of betrayal from within, and now Mira's confession proved it. Yet he also saw the pain in Mira's face and the way she hated the chains that had bound her. He realized that her anger toward him was not only anger at a conqueror, but also anger at her own choices and at the lies that had been forced upon her. Before David could speak, alarms rang through the palace, shouts filled the halls, and the clash of weapons echoed from the outer gates. The rebels had come at last, and the guards rushed to defend the palace. David rose with Mira by his side, and for the first time her fire was not aimed at him but at the enemy who sought to destroy them together. They ran through the corridors where chaos spread like wildfire. Lyra found them in the smoke, her face pale but her eyes fierce. She cried that the rebels had broken through one of the walls and that the council was in danger. David felt fear grip his heart, but he forced himself forward because he knew that if the rebels claimed the palace, then all hope for peace would die in that moment, and the law that had bound him to the wives would be nothing but ashes. They reached the council chamber where the rebels had already struck. David fought with the strength of desperation. Though he was only one man among many, his will to survive burned brighter than the blades that clashed around him. Mira fought beside him, her fury now unleashed against those who had once controlled her. Her strike swift and deadly. Lyra, though gentle, found courage. She shielded a wounded council member and dragged him from danger, even as flames rose around them. Then Tara appeared from the shadows, her calm face lit by firelight. She held in her hands a hidden map that revealed the secret tunnels beneath the palace. She told David that the rebels had used those tunnels to enter, and that if they were not sealed, the palace would fall. David looked into her eyes and saw no fear, only truth, and he realized then that Tara had known of this danger long before it came. She had waited for the moment when the truth would matter most. With Tara's guidance, they sealed the tunnels with fire and stone, and when the rebels tried to push through, they were trapped and broken. The battle raged until the halls were covered in smoke and blood, but at last the sound of steel began to fade, and the rebels fled into the night, leaving behind only ruin and silence. David stood in the broken chamber, his chest heaving, his arms heavy with exhaustion. The council gathered around him, their faces pale with fear, but also with respect, for they had seen him fight, not as a conqueror, but as one who stood for survival beside their people, beside the wives who had once hated him. Lyra placed her hand upon his arm, her touch trembling but steady. Mira stood with blood on her face, her eyes filled with fire, yet no longer aimed at him. Tara stood quiet as always, but her gaze met his, and in that gaze he saw the weight of truths yet to come in. The silence that followed, David realized that the bond between him and the three wives had begun to change. They were no longer only bound by law, they were now bound by battle and by the blood that had been shed together. Yet he also knew that the rebels would not stop, and that the war in the shadows had only just begun. The peace he carried upon his shoulders was fragile, and it would break if he did not hold it with everything he had. That night, as the fires of the battle still burned in the distance, David lay awake in the ruins of the palace with the three wives near, each carrying her own scars of the fight. He thought of Mira's confession, of Tara's secrets, of Lyra's courage, and he knew that the path ahead would demand even more from all of them. He wondered if trust could truly grow in such soil, or if the storm that brewed in the shadows would one day tear them apart. The night after the attack passed heavy and long, and the broken palace carried the smell of smoke and blood, yet within its ruined halls something had shifted. David sat alone as the stars shone through shattered windows, and he thought of all that had happened. He thought of Mira's confession, of Lyra's courage, of Tara's secrets, and of the law that had forced them together, and he wondered if this bond was still only a chain, or if it had become something more. The council gathered the next morning, and their faces were lined with fear, for they knew the rebels would strike again, and they looked to David as if he alone could hold the empire together. Their voices rose with argument. Some demanded that the law be broken, that the wives be returned to their people, to restore order. Others shouted that if the law was broken, peace would die, and rebellion would spread further. David listened in silence, his hands heavy upon the stone before him, until at last he spoke with a voice filled with weariness, yet also strength. He told them that breaking the law would not bring peace, only more chaos, and that if the people wished for unity, then unity must be lived, not only spoken. Council fell silent, for they could not deny his words, but their eyes were filled with doubt, and David knew that only actions would hold them together. He turned then to the three wives who stood near, and he saw in them the true heart of this fragile union. Lyra, who wished for healing; Mira, who carried fire and regret; Tara, who carried secrets that could either destroy or save them. He realized that they were no longer strangers forced upon him, but partners in a fate none of them had chosen yet. All must endure that night, when the moon of the alien world rose high, and silver light poured across the ruins. Another attack came. The rebels had gathered greater strength, and they struck with fury against the gates. The walls shook, the flames spread, and the cries of battle filled the air. David fought with everything within him, his blade flashing, his voice shouting for the defenders to stand strong beside him. Mira fought like a storm, her anger unleashed, not against him but against those who sought to tear her people apart. She struck without fear, and when David stumbled, she was there to guard his back. Lyra, though gentle, moved through the wounded, carrying water and binding wounds, her hands trembling yet steady with courage. Tara guided them through the chaos, her knowledge of the palace and of the tunnels turning the tide again and again. Rebels pushed forward, but the four of them together stood like a single flame that could not be put out. Mira's fire burned with fury, Lyra's hope held the broken together, Tara's wisdom struck at the shadows, and David's human will refused to fall. The battle raged until dawn painted the skies with red, and at last the rebels were broken, their leader struck down, and their forces scattered across the winds. When silence finally came, David stood among the wreckage, his body heavy with wounds, his heart filled with exhaustion. Yet alive he looked to the three wives who stood beside him, each scarred, each marked by the night, yet stronger than before. Lyra's gentle smile shone through her tears. Mira's fierce gaze no longer burned with hate, but with pride. Tara's calm eyes now carried no shadow, only truth. And in that moment, David knew that the bond between them was no longer born of law but of choice. The council came forward, their voices trembling with awe, for they had seen the human and the wives fight side by side. They had seen unity not forced but chosen, and they could no longer deny that peace might truly be possible with them. As one, David told them that the galaxy had watched their war long enough, and that it was time for both people, human and alien, to see that trust could be stronger than blood and that hope could rise from ruins. In the days that followed the fires of rebellion, slowly faded word spread across the cities that the human and the three wives had stood together against the storm, and the people began to whisper not of hate but of respect. Caravans from distant worlds came to see the new union, and though fear still lingered, it was met with curiosity and even hope. David walked among them with the wives at his side, and though he still felt the chains of duty, he also felt something else growing. A bond of trust that no law could have created. Lyra grew brighter with each day, her sorrow easing as she taught David the old songs of her people. Mira still carried her fire, but it no longer burned with hate. She sparred with David in the training halls, her strikes sharp but her laughter rising when he stumbled. Tara revealed more of her knowledge to both him and the council, guiding them with wisdom that many had once feared yet now trusted. Together they built something fragile yet strong, a bridge between two worlds. At night, David often sat with them beneath the alien stars, and he thought of Earth and of all he had lost, and yet he also thought of what he had gained. He had not asked for this path, but it had been given to him, and though it was heavy, he no longer walked it alone. He looked to Lyra's gentle eyes, to Mira's fierce spirit, Tara's calm wisdom, and he knew that they were no longer his wives only by law. They were his partners, his allies, his family, and so peace began to take root in the ashes of war. The galaxy looked to the human and the three alien wives as a symbol not of conquest, but of unity. What began as chains had become choice. What began as law had become bond, and what began with fear had become trust. The old empire was gone, but something new had risen in its place. Something born not of one people, but of many together. As the sun rose on the alien world, David stood with Lyra, Mira, and Tara upon the broken balcony of the palace, the light spilling over their faces and the city beyond them. He felt the weight of the past upon his shoulders, but also the promise of the future. He spoke softly to them, though his voice carried across the wind. He said that though the path ahead would not be easy, they would walk it together, and in their eyes he saw the truth. They believed it too. Galaxy would remember the fall of the alien leader, but it would also remember what came after a human bound by law to three alien wives, who chose not to be enemies, but to stand as one, and in that unity, peace was born. The end.